On today's Gangster Profile, the animal flips. Joe Barbosa turns state's evidence. Joseph the Animal Barbosa, the Portuguese from New Bedford, New Beige, was one of the Boston's underworld's most prolific killers. At one point in his early criminal career, he looked up to the Italian Mafia and greatly admired Raymond Patriarca, and even looked up to Henry Tomiello like sort of a father figure. There's stories that Joe even had pipe dreams as a young hoodlum of becoming the first non-Italian member of the Mafia. I'm not sure how true this is, but it makes for a good tale. Either way, he always showed the Don and his consigliere great respect. When he went to Rhode Island to discuss the William Orfeo hit, Joe offered to do it on the house. Tomiello exclaimed to Raymond, "What'd I tell you about this kid?" Joe swooned at this. He felt like he was in the big time now. He would regularly do things like this to show respect to important people. Them liking him was more important than making money. Besides all his glaring negative traits, he wasn't greedy and he was loyal to his crew members and took care of them. While Joe swooned over Raymond and Henry, he didn't get along with a lot of the younger mafioso. He didn't like how they acted tough because they were with the Mafia, when he felt like a lot of them would be nothing by themselves. The negative feelings were mutual. They didn't like Joe, probably for a multitude of reasons. He seems like he was a pretty easy guy not to like. Apparently, a lot of the younger Mafia members called him a racial slur that I'm not going to repeat. Well, by the end of 1966, things were going south in a big way. Joe and a couple of his crew members were driving around Boston's combat zone, smoking a couple joints and probably saying fresh things to prostitutes when they were pulled over by the BPD. They were in Tosh Brato's Cadillac when they found an M1 rifle and a large knife. They arrested everyone in the car. The other members of his East Boston crew bailed right out because they had low bails, but because of Joe's pending cases, he was held on $100,000 bail, which is big money in those days. His loyal crew members were out on the streets grinding, trying to get his bail up. One of his crew members, Tosh Bratos, was foolishly going around in public, though, saying he was going to kill Larry Bayonne. Bayonne, who was one of the fiercest enforcers in Boston Mafia history, killed Bratos' older brother in the late 1950s. The East Boston crew had raised $72,000, which was very impressive. In a very questionable decision, though, Bratos reached out to the Mafia and asked if they would meet the difference to help spring Joe out. They said sure, but they requested that they bring the money that they had already raised. Red flag. See, the thing is, the Mafia didn't want Joe out of jail. They were officially done with him. Raymond decided he was too much heat and they had to sever ties with him. And this was fine with the Boston guys. They had no love for Barbosa. After the Mafia told Bratos and Deprecio to go get their money, they returned to the Ralphie Chong's Nightlight Cafe in the North End. After a few seconds of them entering the bar, they were executed, relieved of their cash, and piled on top of each other in the trunk of Bratos' Cadillac. They were discovered later in the Gangland Cemetery in the D Street Projects in Southie. While Ralphie Chong and his crew tried to clean up the evidence, the Boston police showed up and arrested them. Chico Amico had tipped off the cops when he never heard back from Bratos and Deprecio. Larry Bayonne was livid. "You don't hit him inside the joint! You take him outside and you crack him right there on the fucking sidewalk!" If Larry Bayonne was mad, Joe Barbosa was going berserk. He was locked in a cage, the Mafia double-crossed him, they killed his crew member and friends, and now they stole his bail money. Barbosa was right at the tipping point. He had no hope of getting out now. He was pissed at the Mafia, and he wanted revenge. Chico Amico gathered what was left of Barbosa's allies and asked for support with a counterattack. Nobody wanted to take on the Italian Mafia. Chico was disgusted. He said he'd handle it himself. A cop saw Chico out and told him to be careful. There was a bounty on him. He shook it off, and later that night, after pulling off Squire Road in Revere onto Route 1, a car quickly gave chase. Amico and fellow Barbosa gang member James Kearns. Someone in the other sedan, most likely sharpshooter J.R. Russo, shot Amico in the back of the head several times with an M1 rifle, killing him instantly. Kearns was hit and crashed the car but survived. Now this was the actual tipping point for Barboza. He loved Amico like a younger brother, and it broke his heart. He cried that night in his cell thinking about his friend, but then he was consumed by anger and he wanted revenge. The only problem was he had no crew left and he was stuck in prison. He reached out to a police officer and said to get Patsy Fabiano and James Kearns off the street. They were the only members left out there and he wanted them to be safe. And then he contacted the Boston FBI office and said he wanted to talk. By the end of the 1950s, the FBI was obsessed with taking down the Italian Mafia. After decades of denying their existence, J. Edgar Hoover was declaring them the biggest threat to our society besides black nationalist groups and the commies. The FBI office in Boston was notoriously corrupt well before John Connolly. Agents Paul Rico and Dennis Condon manipulated everyone in the 1960s Boston underworld. They made sure their guys were the ones that had the prominent positions. During the 1960s gang war, the FBI played a major part in who were the victors and who were the losers. If the FBI wanted to, they could bury you simply because they did not like you. They were always looking for people to enlist in their top echelon informant program. They wanted to recruit people who had a strong working relationship with the Italian Mafia and could provide damning testimony on them. So when Joe Barbosa reached out to the FBI and said he wanted to talk and had good information on the office, agents Rico and Condon were salivating at the mouth. Barbosa had legitimate knowledge against the office, for he used to have a good working relationship with Tomiello and Raymond, and he also had a giant-sized grudge to settle with them. Even though Joe Barbosa didn't kill Willie Marfeo, he did cross state lines to discuss the murder with Raymond and Tomiello. That in itself is enough to charge them federally with conspiracy. Plus the fact that Willie Marfeo was killed shortly after did not help them. Barbosa wanted to bury them. He hated the office for what they had done. He was going to make sure he put all the major players in prison, whether or not they actually did what he said they'd done. He also had smaller, more personal scores to settle, and he would use this as an opportunity to get his revenge. The FBI was willing to do whatever to get Barbosa's testimony. They were completely obsessed with destroying the Mafia. They knew that Barbosa was a dirtbag murderer and that the majority of his info was garbage, but they didn't care. As soon as Barbosa started talking to the feds, they took him out of the Massachusetts state prison system and placed him in faraway Barnstable County Jail in protective custody. He said if he was going to go through with this, the feds would need to protect his wife and daughter. They weren't safe alone in their Swampscott home. He claimed they were going to need a fortress to protect him from the office. The feds found the closest thing. Joe's wife Claire and his daughter were collected from their Swampscott home, and Joe was moved from Barnstable County Jail. They were relocated them on Thatcher's Island off the coast of Rockport. This island holds the famous Twin Lights, two identical lighthouses built in the 1800s. He and his family, along with 20 or so U.S. Marshals, made this their home during the trials to come. Barbosa did not like his new dwellings. It was infested with rodents and seagull shit. To entertain himself, Barbosa trained his dog to attack the marshals. He constantly bumped heads with his handler, U.S. Marshal John Partington, who during the trials played kind of a surrogate husband role to Joe's wife Claire when Joe wasn't around. The office thought of everything to get Barbosa. They had snipers on fishing boats, but they couldn't get close enough to get a clear shot. They thought about dropping a bomb out of a low-flying plane. When the U.S. Marshals escorted Barbosa in and out of court for the trial of Patriarca, they would dress Barbosa up like one of the U.S. Marshals and mix him in with the agents. During the trial, the court was under incredibly strict security. This was a big deal. They flew Barbosa in and out of Boston by helicopter. It wasn't safe to drive all the way to the courthouse. To try to dissuade Barbosa from testifying or lawyers from working with him, the Mafia blew up his lawyer John Fitzgerald's car. Fitzgerald would end up losing a leg as a result, and Cadillac Frank Salami did about 20 years in prison for it. The marshals also discovered a bomb made with nitroglycerin underneath a car that was supposed to be used to transport Barbosa. During a pretrial hearing, there was a tense exchange between Barbosa and Raymond Patriarca when they finally came face to face. Raymond yelled, "You fucking rat!" To which Barbosa replied, "You go fuck your dead mother in the mouth!" Patriarca and Tomiello were convicted in the Willie Marfeo case. This was a huge victory for the feds, but the most infamous case that Barbosa testified in and completely perjured himself was the Teddy Deegan murder trial. Edward Teddy Deegan was a tough career criminal from Chelsea, Mass., whose specialty was burglary. He and Barbosa's beloved friend, the deranged maniac Jimmy the Bear Flemmy, were embroiled in a bitter beef that was only going to end with one of them dying. While luring Deegan to his death with a fake robbery of a business in downtown Chelsea, he was shot in the back of the head and left to die in a Chelsea alley. Barboza used this murder to get revenge on the Italian Mafia enemies and to get his buddy Jimmy the Bear clear of the crime. He implicated Henry Tomiello, Peter Limone, Louis Greco, and Joseph Salvati. Barboza had personal beefs with every one of these men. Louis Greco had beaten one of Joe's crew members, Nick Famia, in East Boston in front of a crowd, embarrassing him. Peter Limone had ejected Joe and barred him from his club for bringing heat there and was a rising star in the Mafia. Jerry Angiulo was especially sick about losing Limone. Barboza felt that Tomiello had betrayed him after he looked up to him like somewhat of a father figure. But probably the most trivial reason was Joseph Salvati, who wasn't even mobbed up. He simply refused to pay a small loan back to Joe's underling while they were trying to collect bail. Tomiello and Greco would get the death penalty, while Peter Limone and Joseph Salvati got life. Joseph Salvati's wife and family were crushed and confused. He was just a working guy, and now he was doing life in prison. The craziest thing about all this is that the FBI knew about this the whole time and could care less. The more Mafia guys off the street, the better. It didn't matter if they were guilty or not. I mean it when I say that the FBI hated the Mafia. In a meeting with Frank Salemi, Agent Dennis Condon asked Salemi how he thought Louis Greco liked it on death row. He said this while knowing the man was innocent of the crime. Wow. Salemi was disgusted, and he ended up getting into an argument with Condon, and he distanced himself from the feds for a time. Louis Greco and Henry Tomiello would die of natural causes while in prison. When finally, over 30 years later, all the dirt about the FBI Boston office came out, Limone and Salvati were released and received large payments for what they had suffered. It did little, though, to give them and their families back over 30 years. Barboza knew that he would never be safe, and so did the feds. This led to the creation of the Federal Witness Protection Program. That's right, Joe Barbosa was the first ever person in the Witness Protection Program. They started it because of him. After his epic and highly publicized trials, Barbosa was relocated to Northern California. The life of a mob witness's wife was too much for Claire, and his loyal wife ended up filing for divorce. Joe couldn't change his ways, and not long after being relocated, Joe killed a small-time drug dealer and tried to bury him in the woods. The FBI intervened, and Joe only did a couple years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. Upon his release, Joe was walking home to his apartment one day when a van pulled up alongside him. The sliding door flew open, and J.R. Russo, the East Boston assassin, instantly blasted Barbosa with a carbine, separating Barbosa's spirit from his body. Russo became legend for this hit. Barbosa, the New England Mafia's #1 enemy, was dead. But the damage he and the FBI did to the Mafia could not be repaired. They just kept unraveling for the next few decades. The FBI proved that they were not afraid to play dirty against the Mafia, and that innocent men were just collateral damage. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you're not subscribed, please do so. It's a great choice. Please leave a comment, make a request, but most of all, take care of yourselves and have a great day.